I'm only going to say this one time. All of you have the weekend. Think about whether or not you want to be on this team or not. Under the following condition. What I say when it comes to this basketball team is the law. Absolutely and without discussion.
So every one of you should recognize that scene from what I think is the best sports film of all time, Hoosiers. If you don't remember it, I think it's time for you to rewatch that classic. My kids and I just watched it the other night, and this scene reminded me of a time in sports when the position, the title of being coach, it commanded respect from athletes and others. And when you as a coach didn't get that respect, you could demand it from your athletes, and you'd have the backing of parents and administration. Today in coaching, heck, even in just leadership, it feels like respect is less common. Now, I know I'm working hard as a parent to teach my children that it doesn't matter whether they like or they feel like their coach or teacher is doing a good job. Those people deserve their respect because they are giving up their time to coach and teach them. I recognize I'm probably a little old school in that, but I see a lack of respect for people showing up all over. And I think this is a value. We need to be more intentional about teaching our children and athletes today. And while we are going to talk about ways to teach respect to our athletes today, we're also going to talk about the reality that you just can't demand respect like Coach Norman Dale and Hoosiers. Respect, the deep kind of respect that we all want from our athletes, it has to be earned. And that's really what we're unpacking, how to teach and also earn respect in today's athletes. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, the podcast to help you grow as a leader and build a better culture. My name is JP Nerman, and I'm joined by my friends and co-host, Nate Sanderson and Betsy Butterick. In addition to this podcast, I'm the founder of TOC, which supports leaders and their teams to build extraordinary cultures through one-on-one coaching, consulting, online training, and speaking. To learn more about TOC, I recommend starting with these 3 steps. First off, read the culture system. Secondly, subscribe to the TOC newsletter. You're going to get the podcast notes to this in every episode. And thirdly, get trained through our transformational coaching and culture certification program. You can do all these things and access other free resources at tocculture.com. To learn more about Betsy Butterick and her work as a leadership coach, go to betsybutterick.com.
Nate, JP, without giving away our exact ages, I think that all of us were raised in an era where respecting your elders was something that we learned from a very young age. Respect was something that you gave people who were older than you or more experienced than you or in some sort of positional power. And I think about last year when I was visiting with the Las Vegas Raiders for the first time, I was introduced to a young man. I didn't know him at the time. I had to Google him afterwards. And my point of contact said, Jacoby, this is Betsy. She's going to be working with the coaches. What's one piece of advice you would give to the coaches on how to best work with a guy like you? And the first thing this man said was, don't yell at me. Talk to me. Talk to me like I'm somebody that you respect. And I remember that striking me because I thought, oh gosh, this is the NFL, this is football. I think yelling is, kind of historically par for the course within this sport culture. And yet what he said is very much indicative of what we're also hearing from today's athletes of various ages, that the nature of respect is changing. And that's really what I want to explore with both of you today is what's that about? Like, why don't we simply outright respect our elders anymore? And how does that show up in the coach-athlete relationship? Nate, I know that you've had some conversations recently with some athletes about respect. I'd love to hear more about what those conversations entail.
Yeah, Betsy. So just getting ready for this topic here this week, I reached out to about half of our returning players and happened to be in a athletic performance class with a bunch of our football guys and basketball guys at Mount Vernon. And knowing we were going to talk about this, I just asked them kind of as a conversation starter here, what are things that coaches do that you respect or that help you to respect them as leaders? And And it was really interesting because I talked to probably between 12 and 15 kids. Some of them I've coached, some of them I have not. And their responses were incredibly consistent. And I think the number one thing that is probably different that came out of that conversation than maybe would have been 20 years ago when I started coaching was this belief, this firm belief that respect is earned. A coach has to earn a certain level of respect from their players. Now, we're in a great culture and our kids are very respectful by nature, but there's a level there that positional authority is only going to go so far if I'm not doing other things to be able to earn and maintain the respect of our players. And so that was very interesting to me because, as I said, that's a lot different than 20 years ago when I started. You could demand respect and players, generally speaking, would respond, but there's a little bit more to it today than maybe there used to be.
I think one of the other things that I build off of that, knowing young people today and my experiences in coaching, is yes, it's true. They feel coaches have to earn their respect. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing that we in leadership have to live with integrity. We have to live according to our values. And when we don't, we could lose respect. I think that's totally legitimate. I think another thing that's different, though, that maybe the young people are not aware, is that there's the feeling of respect that I feel like I respect this individual, that should be earned. But there's also respect, the verb, which is just showing someone respect. And I think what's maybe a little bit different also about this generation is that many athletes, young people in today's world don't feel like they have to show someone respect because they don't feel like they respect them. And that's just not actually really good practice. That's not the way the world works, right? I mean, if you're in a job today, you could lose respect for your boss, but you still have to show respect to that individual. And the same, should be if you could lose respect of a teammate, if you're an athlete on a team, because of they're not working hard or they didn't have a good attitude in the moment, but you still, if you're a good teammate, you show them respect. And so what I think is problematic around this change is not that coaches have to earn respect. I think it's just there is this maybe excuses that we come up with or legitimizing why we act a certain way to show disrespect towards a coach, a leader, referees, a teammate. And I think that's a cultural challenge that we as transformational coaches can really try to work with our athletes on.
And you bring up an interesting point there, JP, where when we hear about respect, whether it's in social media or in the context of a sport environment, the way it's often phrased is you disrespected me or that was disrespectful. Very rarely do you hear that was super respectful. Like, thank you for respecting me, right? So we hear about it when it's a problem and not as often about when it's an asset or it's a modeled value. It's a verb, as you were saying. Let's explore, and Nate, if you want to pull from those conversations that you had, you mentioned a consistency in response. What are some of the consistent elements that young people cited as important for a coach earning their respect?
Yeah, there was really 4 things that came out, and I would say 3/4 of the kids mentioned 1, 2, or 3, or sometimes all 4 of these things. I mean, it was, as you said, very consistent in terms of what they identified as ways that coaches have earned their respect. So number 1 was just this idea of communication, the fact that they were honest, the fact that they had a two-way street when it came to communication. They were open to feedback. They were interested in their players' opinions. They communicated with their players about roles or about their assignments or about their playing time. They didn't just, send messages with the bench and hope kids figured it out, right? They had open lines of communication, was number 1. And I think that really ties into number 2 for them, which was coaches demonstrated care for them as a person. So if you care for me, then you're invested in my success. You're going to communicate with me in a way that's going to help me to pursue my goals or pursue our goals. But that communication and care piece, they go hand in hand in validating the person that the coach is working with in the sport. There's another one that came up with just credibility. And I think this makes perfect sense. When you talk to players that maybe their coach doesn't have a great handle on how to coach the sport, or modern ways to coach the sport, or effective ways to coach the sport, or they haven't been successful for whatever reason, the results haven't followed the process, it's hard for players, at a certain point to really respect them if they are lacking in just competency, when it comes to coaching their sport. And then the last one, and JP's alluded to this a little bit already, is just the idea of consistency. Like, you got to show up to be yourself as a coach, um, the same way every day, in a sense. Like, we can't pretend to be somebody else. We can't, promise somebody playing time and then 3 months later they're not getting it, with no communication as to why. We can't demand players be on time on Mondays, but then on Thursdays when the star players are late, it's okay. Like, there has to be a consistency across the board. There has to be integrity from the coach, where their behaviors, their words are going to match the values that they expose personally, their values personally and collectively as a program. And really, just about everything that we do as coaches can be tied into one of those four things. But those things were what really mattered to the players that I talked to about how coaches can earn respect.
When I hear what you share there, Nate, I feel like some of those things, I don't know how much we would have valued those 20, 30 years ago as a player. I don't know if I ever said, I really hope my coach cares about me as a person, but I love that. Like, I think that's a great expectation to have. And I guess I'm actually curious to throw it to you, Betsy, here, which is just, you got the information from that NFL athlete. Hey, don't yell at me. Talk to me like I'm someone you respect. So that's challenging potentially common coach practices around communication. When you shared that with those NFL coaches, what was their reaction to that?
Yeah, it's all in framing the message, right? So I didn't walk into the room and say, hey, your guys would prefer if you don't yell at them. Let's revolutionize football at the highest level. I was doing a Gen Z session on effective coaching practices for working with today's athlete. And this is a question I often ask in rooms full of coaches across sport. I said, I'm going to ask you a question. And in a minute, I'm simply going to invite you to raise your hand if this is true for you. How many of you in the room today have had an athlete question your knowledge that feels like a direct disrespect to your authority or position? Without fail, across sport, hundreds of coaches say, yeah, like, I can't believe they questioned this, in the middle of this game or in whatever context. I'll say, yeah, here's the thing. What I'm learning is that because of technology, the young people we're coaching today have been able, with a few keystrokes in nanoseconds, get millions of data points relevant to whatever question is on their mind. So I invite coaches to start to look at those challenges to authority as a very well practiced skill. Young people have been able to Google, we'll say, any question that they have, and information comes back instantaneously. Young people are often using their coaches today just like Google, and it's not in any way meant to be disrespectful. One of those same sessions where I'd asked that question, I had a member of Gen Z come up to me and said, Betsy, when you asked that question about how many people have been questioned and it feels like an affront to their knowledge or authority, it feels like disrespect. She said, I immediately understood why, as an assistant coach, when I asked my head coach mid-game why he chose that tactical change, he looked like I had slapped his grandmother. She said, I meant no disrespect to his years of experience. I simply wanted to understand why we pivoted away from the game plan. And so the element of respect, yes. And it begs the question, what do we as coaches today see as disrespectful? What do athletes see as disrespectful? And you brought up before, Nate, inconsistency. And I wholeheartely agree. Consistency in personality, having that personal integrity is paramount to not only earning respect, but also maintaining an element of psychological safety. And yet we also know, as coaches, part of our responsibility is to pivot or make adjustments on the fly. And sometimes we don't get the chance to explain what can be perceived as a lack of integrity or inconsistency, or at worst, something that's disrespectful. So how do we navigate this as coaches? What is it that we need to do in order to maintain respect, but also do the job we're tasked to do in a way that feels like it's taking into account what is respectful for the situation.
Yeah, but see, I think you're on something really important there, which is, obviously there's different things that we can do to earn respect as coaches, but there's also, different ways that we define respect as athletes and as coaches and even, coaches amongst our staff. What does it mean to show respect? What does it mean to be disrespectful? And what is often we would say, oh my gosh, I can't believe they would do that. It's so disrespectful from our athletes today, right? To ask, to question, to challenge us, to them, that's just very common, and accepted. I think one thing that coaches that I work with struggle when it comes around to respect, I think you're touching on there, is there's a bit of like demanding respect in the coach's mind, which is getting the benefit of the doubt. And I think people are very quick in today's generation to lose that respect for a coach because of a perceived action and completely forget about their previous things that they had done to earn that. And I just feel that I see it a lot in coaching. Coaches do a lot to build this credibility. They may make a mistake, or they don't make a mistake. They just do something that the players perceive as against what they said or against their values. And instantly they can go to a place of, well, now I'm in a place where I can stand up and I can challenge the coach. And I mean, another thing too is just time and place, right? I think we're seeing more athletes are open to challenging coaches in a public setting rather than doing it in a respectful manner of pulling a coach aside and actually expressing their frustrations or asking questions. So I think that's just one area that I would think we might explore a little bit, is just that idea of just another way that how our definitions of respect differ.
I think another thing that's important for coaches to understand about how players think about this word respect is that number one, it's a two-way street. That's a phrase that came up in a couple of my conversations. Players expect to be respected in order to return respect to their coach, right? And I think that's true for all of us, right? Like we want that reciprocation. If we're going to give someone respect, we hope that we get that in return. But what does that really mean to a player? I think if I was to boil everything down that I talked about with them, it really comes down to this idea that you're giving the players agency. You're respecting their ability to improve, to provide feedback, to ask questions, to pursue their own sort of goals within the team, goals, to be a part of and have control over the process that makes them better, that makes the team better. And I do think that that's a bit of a shift from what coaching was like, again, 20 years ago, is that a lot of that was solely the coach's responsibility to plot the way forward, issue the commands, and everybody was supposed to follow them. And hopefully we have good results. And now it's a much more collaborative approach. But I think when we invest in that, when we invest in the agency through communication and care and the things we talked about before, I think the result of that is perhaps a higher level of respect that players have for us that allows us to be even more effective than what we just have as a positional authority, as a person with a title or a person that's in charge of the gym. And I think for coaches, when it comes to doing the hard work here, that's important to remember, is that this is going to make you better. This is going to enhance your relationships with players. It's going to make you a more effective coach if we can have a better understanding of what this word really means today.
Yeah, and when you say what it means, and I often extrapolate what it means to what it looks like, or what are our expectations around this thing. And what you just said, Nate, has also shown up in conversations I've had with athletes. Two-way street. Athletes expect to be shown respect, and then they will give respect. And if I ask them, does a coach have to earn your respect before you give it? They'll say yes. But to them, like, they expect that we respect them right away. But then often there's a delay for them before they show or respect a coach. So I try to point out gently and clearly that might be an unfair expectation, and is that something that they want to revisit? Nate, you mentioned that agency, and I often use the word co-creation and how important it is and advantageous it is for coaches to co-create the sport experience with today's athletes. Where I see coaches hesitate is when they worry, or more accurately misunderstand, that co-creating giving agency, inviting our athletes to be part of the conversation is at the expense of their positional power or knowledge or authority. And I try to clarify and say, no, get really clear on what are your negotiables, what are your non-negotiables, what areas or avenues are you comfortable inviting other perspectives, specifically those of your athletes, into the conversation to create this shared experience together? And what's off the table for you that this is simply the way it's going to be? And then how are you going to communicate those expectations to the people that are part of the program and to the collective experience? So touching really on that, your point of we earn more respect from today's athletes when we involve them in the conversation than when we don't. When we simply try to tell them, well, I'm the coach and I'm in charge, or I'm the boss and say so. And not just today's athletes. I hear assistant coaches as well. Like, I was so frustrating and it felt disrespectful when my head coach said, well, because I said so. Like, because I said so is a sign of disrespect for both people younger and older.
I think one more piece of this, Betsy, is that respect it's something that has to be maintained over time. Again, 20 years ago, you might just demand or expect that when players walk into the gym, because you're the head coach, like they're going to instantly give you like this coupon for respect, and now you just have it, or you don't. And the reality is, like, we're constantly building this level of respect and continuing to hopefully have it increase from our players, but it can be very fragile. It's very much like trust in the sense that, it takes a long time to build, but it can be, eroded or broken very quickly. And so I think it is important for us to not just have a philosophical understanding for what are we talking about here and what does respect mean to our young people, but also just what does that mean for me and my behaviors so that I'm doing my best to continue to increase the respect that we have for each other and avoiding pitfalls and traps that sometimes can erode that level of respect very quickly.
Yeah, and I often think in analogies and metaphors, Nate, and you said that it's not a one-time thing. And you mentioned you get this ticket where it's like, oh, I've earned the respect. That's good. And I'm thinking like, gosh, it would be so great if the one time I vacuumed my house was now like forever clean. That would be amazing. And we know that's not how cleaning or houses work. We've talked a little bit about agency, co-creation as one way or avenue in which coaches can continuously earn the respect of their athletes. I'm curious to know from both of your experiences and perspective, what else can coaches do in that pursuit to be intentional about being someone who is earning the respect of those in their program?
Probably the biggest and most important thing is just that we model respect. We just show our athletes respect on a consistent basis. A little cliche, but really, really true. I think within that, though, we want to have greater awareness of how I define respect as a coach and how my athletes define respect, and start to see where that might actually create problems. Because I could say, well, I'm showing them respect, but back to your point, there could be things that are perceived as disrespectful. And do we have certain expectations or standards around respect that are not realistic? For instance, I coach here in Ireland. If I felt like respect was shown by saying yes sir, no sir, that's just not something that's said here. It would be an unrealistic expectation, and I probably wouldn't get a lot, very far, running around and carrying that definition or behavior that I felt, showed respect. So I think an awareness of how we're all defining respect is a really important place, so we make sure that we're demonstrating it as much as we can. But I think the next step I would say is that we actually spend time. If respect is important, it's a value of ours. We're going to spend time as a team defining that. And what does it look like? What does it not look like? What does it look like to be disrespectful? Having a conversation where players and coaches can co-create behaviors around that value of respect, and then they're constantly reestablished throughout the year. Some of the teams that I'm working with, they're really just coming back to their core values. One of those is USA Women's Field Hockey, and they're doing some reflection as players right now on different aspects of their program. And one of their values is respect. Okay, well, what's respect looking like in these different scenarios, right? They're revisiting it. It's not just something they did 6 months ago. They're coming back to it, 3-4 months before the Olympics here. So are we establishing a common shared of, okay, this is what we agree respect looks like? And then before we start demanding it, right? I think as coaches, we have to support. And one of the best ways we have to support is to recognize and acknowledge the feelings of our players. So when there's a moment where they perceive that we've done something that's disrespectful, or or they have an emotional reaction, and we perceive that they're doing something really disrespectful, we got to come back to empathy and connection. But then with that, we can kind of come in and we can actually enforce a standard. We can hold them to, hey, that's not how we're going to do things here. And we've talked about when things don't go well, this is how we have hard conversations, or this is how we deal with these situations. But you have to define those behaviors first, so then you can reflect back and say, hey, we said we were going to handle it this way, not this way. Like, this is what respect means. So, but that never happens effectively if you haven't consistently established those standards and got real clarity. So it's easy for us to come in and say, okay, well, I've shown my players I'm, respect. I can go and demand it. No. Got to get more clarity before you can start to demand respect.
Yeah, JP, one of the exercises, and you mentioned working with teams, that I've done with teams around respect is almost a Mad Libs of sorts, where you're going to complete the phrase, because I respect you, I will blank. Because I respect you, I will not, or I won't blank, which really gets into what are those observable, actionable behaviors that demonstrate respect? And also, what am I intentionally going to do or not do because I respect you? You mentioned empathy and validation. And for me, a precursor of sorts is curiosity. So let's say generationally, even, I feel that an athlete did something that was disrespectful to me as their coach. So before I label it as disrespectful, can I be intentional about having a follow-up conversation that says, hey, what was your intention there? Like, what were you going for when you put me on blast in front of the team and made my coaching decision seem like it was silly, right? So I'm going to have the conversation first, just to get really clear, so that then we can have an elevated conversation about, okay, here's how in the future you could do that in a more respectful way. And these are our shared commitments around what that looks like, so that we continually learn and refine, to your point, what is respect in the context of our program.
Yeah, I think for me, Betsy and JP, that the conversation is so enlightening. I mean, even just asking this question of athletes as we're getting ready for this conversation, or this discussion today, was great learning for me. Just better understanding how our players view that, and just I think there's another piece of that conversation too, and you kind of alluded to it there. The players don't really understand necessarily what a coach feels like respectful behavior is to them. And sometimes we walk into gyms and classrooms with this idea of this is what it looks like for a student or a player to respect me. Kids have no idea. I mean, they have no idea, right? And so now we have these triggers where we're responding to things, and they have no clue that they're an affront to us because we haven't had the conversation. They don't know how to understand me better. I don't know how to understand them better. So I think that whatever you can do along those lines is only going to help, right? When we think about really specific, like behavioral things, if you want a couple shortcuts for coaches that are trying to just, earn more respect from their players in easy ways, I think number one is being respectful of players' time. Like, that came out with football players, basketball players, my players, in these conversations. If we're getting out at 6 o'clock, get us out at 6 o'clock or before. If you say we're having a day off, don't change your mind. Just the idea of let's be efficient and let's let kids go live their lives because they have other things they want to do outside of sport, even if we don't have a life outside of sport. That goes so far when you just demonstrate that respect for the player's time. I think another one, just thinking back to season 1 of Ted Lasso, when there's the comment in the box about how the shower heads suck, and he fixed the shower heads. Being responsive to your players' needs, especially the low-hanging fruits. I mean, I remember with our team when volleyball started providing a box of snacks for the kids to get into after school before practice, and just how much better they felt about that. And they let me know, gosh, can we still have snacks in basketball? That's something I never thought of before. It's not something we've ever done before, but it was maybe one of the best things that we did just for kids, because we were responsive to this idea that it's a long time since lunch and they're hungry and they get crabby and snacks help, and we could do something simply to help that. Then we did. And that, again, it demonstrates the agency of the player coming to the coaching staff and saying, here's something we could do to improve it. And when we're responsive to that, that's a deposit into the level of respect that they have for us. I think it's also worth mentioning that there's maybe some red flags to kind of be aware of, that if you're resorting to some of these strategies, you probably need to do a little bit more. In other words, I remember, JP, we had a consultant on in the NFL world here a few years ago that was talking about trying to bring a different approach to practice. And I think he was going to the Dallas Cowboys or some team like that. So he watched practices and gave some suggestions to, the coaching staff, and they blew him off and ridiculed him for his ideas. And he pushed back with science and research and rational thinking. And the coach pulled out of his pocket his NFC championship ring and just threw it on the table and said, when you get one of these, let's come back and have a conversation. If you're reverting back to your record, your results, your conference championships, like that's what you're relying on in order to earn the respect of players or your coaches on your staff or the parents in your program, there's more to it than that. Like that does demonstrate credibility, but it says nothing to the agency of those that help you get there. And I think that's something really we have to be a little bit aware of. And you've also talked about this earlier. Anytime, and this is true for my kids as much as it is my players, if my justification for something is because I said so, yes, that's cringe, right? Especially with today's athletes. So we have to be aware of those things too, that if I'm resorting to that, I've got a little bit more work to do to try to build up that respect from my players.
Nate, as you're talking, I'm thinking of the number of coaches who have told me some version of like, I can't stand when kids come into film and they have their hoods up, right? Like that's so disrespectful. And then if I ask the kids like, hey, what's with the hood up? They're like, what do you mean? It's like, well, your coaches sometimes see you having your hood on as disrespectful. They're like, that's silly. That's like my shoes untied. And so I'm being disrespectful. Like for them, it's just another article of clothing and how they like to wear it. It's not at all intended to be disrespectful. So having the conversation, getting really clear, something any coach at any time, regardless of what sport, what season, what level, how many championship rings you can or can't throw on a table, like this is a conversation that people can have. To say, hey, here's how I see respect. Here's also kind of my respect triggers or things that I feel are really disrespectful. What's your take on those? Also, what's true for you? And then continuing to have the conversation. Again, we're so quick to label things respectful, disrespectful. What if they're different to start? And then we have a follow-up conversation. Like that's something that any coach can make a regular part of practice. I know there's a few more ideas out there. What else can coaches do, or what do we need to cover when we talk about respect here?
I think there's just two more things I'd offer up here. And I think it is when it comes to what we're trying to teach and trying to develop within our athletes around this value, this virtue of respect, so that we all can show respect towards each other. I think once you've set a standard, a boundary on how we want to behave here, how we want to act, how we want to show respect towards each other, I think it's important for us as leaders, as coaches, as even as parents in our own home, to demand that respect, to hold athletes to that standard. And how we can do that in a respectful way is sometimes to maybe even like with my kids or even a player is to have a strong conviction in my tone that this is what we agreed to and this is what's going to happen, or else you're choosing consequences, right? And we talk about this in the podcast. I've written about it extensively in the culture system. There's so much around the tone of how we enforce boundaries and enforce that standard that's really important. But if we don't have that strength, that conviction in our voice, then oftentimes I don't think we're necessarily demanding respect, right? And there's not that, well, are they serious about this or not? They don't really listen up. And I can just think about the times that I've asked my kids multiple times to empty the dishwasher and they just didn't listen. It's just like all I had to do is just have a sharpness, a conviction, still respectful, still emotionally regulated, but just like, no, this is what we're all doing right now. And there's not a time for people to vote on, well, we want to do these 500 things before we empty the dishwasher, right? So I think this is a really important thing. And I guess I'd offer this up last too, is I really believe, and I've loved this, preparing for this episode, because I recognize how much, respect is, I think, important, and how much as I think as coaches, it's, I hope people listening to this aren't like, oh, they're just caving into the players, caving in. No, I think we're working with them to actually help them to develop this virtue, this value of respect, because we can all be better at it, right? We can all be more respectful towards our players as coaches, but our players also need to develop this. And so I think this is a value and virtue that's worth fighting for. And so I'd encourage us to, all coaches listening to this, to make sure, first off, we're doing some of those things to earn that respect and establish that, definition of respect. But then we got to come in there, we got to demand it, we got to fight for it.
And you're saying command or demand, and every time you say demand, I'm also hearing command. What is the presence? What is the authority? What is the conviction in which I'm occupying a space that allows people to really hear me and to take me seriously? In closing, again, for folks listening, I think oftentimes when we talk about subjects like this, whether it's accountability and today it's respect, it's, here's what you can do, here's what you should avoid. And to remember that I think one of the most respectful things we can do when we are imperfect, which most of us are, especially if we're in the business of sports and trying to grow and develop not only young people, but ourselves, is to circle back, to own the fact that we've made a mistake or we showed up in a way that was out of integrity or inconsistent from who we take ourselves to be or who we aspire to be. So as much as we've talked about respect today and being a two-way street, the things that we can do, one thing I want to really wrap up with is when we miss the mark, an action of respect, both for the people that may unintentionally have been harmed in some way by that missing of the mark, but also as a way to build respect back after it's been lost, is to take ownership for whatever is ours to own in any situation.
All due respect, Betsy, I'd like to add something here. Well, I think the one thing I would add as we get coaches out the door here is that if you're struggling to really understand the difference between what respect was in the old world, this commanding, demanding, positional authority respect, and the kind of respect that we're talking about that we're striving to earn from our players, I would just challenge coaches to do this. Think about the person in your life that you've had the most respect for. And what did they do? And how did they earn that respect from you? Because I think that provides a roadmap for, number one, the kind of level of respect that we're talking about and striving for here, because you've experienced it, giving it to someone else, and then thinking about, man, what did that person do? It probably wasn't their title. It probably wasn't their championships. It probably wasn't their accomplishments. There was probably something more there in terms of how they interacted with you, how they communicated with you, how they demonstrated and lived the things that they said were important, that were inspirational to you. And I think therein lies the lessons for all of us to start considering that person and how can I be more like that? So someday when your players are asked that same question and you come to mind, it becomes instructional for them too.
So, just a few thoughts to close up today's episode and conversation. While I think all of us want to be treated with respect, the respect that was more common and expected 10 to 20 years ago from athletes, I think what we really want is the deeper respect we discussed today, that respect that has to be earned. As I kind of reflect back on the fictional story in the movie Hoosiers, and if you've ever seen the film, there are multiple points in the film where head coach Norman Dale earns the respect and love of his players. The pivotal moment of earning that respect was not that moment I shared earlier in the episode where he demands that respect. It was in his consistency and his discipline, enforcing this rule he had for the team to make 4 passes before they shoot. It was in his respect of the players. There's this amazing moment early in the season at pep rally where the fans at the school are chanting the name of Jimmy, the school star player who had quit the team, and because they want Jimmy to come back on the team. And Coach Norman Dale goes up and stands in front of the team and looks at the crowd and says, no, this team, they deserve your respect for your commitment. By standing up for his team, for his players there, he earned their respect. I think another great one in the story, in the film, is just his genuine care for his players, which he shows in many ways. And one of those is in just trying to help the alcoholic father of one of his players get sober. And so I know this is fictional, but I think it's really important that you look at whether it's fictional stories or real stories, like Nate said, there's things that we have to do consistently over time to earn that real respect that we want from our players. So, in summary, here are my two encouragements for all of us as coaches. First, yes, we need to command respect for us, respect for each other, respect for all people. It's a value worth fighting for, even if today's generation is not being taught it by their parents and, in many cases, today's educational system. Secondly, that's not enough for us as transformational coaches just to go around and demanding and commanding respect. We, like Coach Normandale, need to earn the respect, the deep respect where players look up to us, to see us as a role model worth following. Coaches, don't forget to subscribe to the TOC newsletter every Thursday. You'll receive a short article, and you'll also receive the notes to each episode of the podcast. As well as when you subscribe, you get the top 10 podcast episodes and top 10 articles in case you've missed those. Subscribe using the link in the description of this episode, or simply go to tocculture.com and click on newsletter. Thanks for listening in. Please be sure to share this episode if you found it valuable, as well as leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts.